Um, so those are the two. So the IEP and the Stanford often, particularly when we're teaching first year students, will refer the students to look at those. They give overviews of philosophical issues. We never refer our students to Wikipedia, but Wikipedia we will see has a contribution to make. So when I look at philosophy of religion itself as a topic in the, let me see, my first slide, the Stanford and IEP, so the Stanford kind of introductory paragraph is at the top, and they really do pick up on the kind of philosophical approach to religion, that is looking at themes and concepts, considering the nature of religion itself and the general features of the cosmos. So that's the Stanford at the top. The IEP is the second. It has that same philosophical approach, looking at meaning and nature, religious concepts, but it adds something, and that includes more recent work that involves a global approach, looking at both theistic and non-theistic religious traditions, looking at diversity amongst religions, and connecting philosophy of religions to other relevant fields, so introducing an element of interdisciplinarity, including theology, history, sociology, psychology, and the natural science. That diversity is missing in the Stanford approach to philosophy of religion. So the Stanford lists a bunch of main themes as that kind of relate to philosophy of religion within its entry, and most of these are pretty standard in terms of philosophy of religion, and certainly in the analytic tradition. And you can see religious pluralism does get a mention, but it's towards the end of the article, and other elements of philosophy of religion are much more prominent. Wikipedia rips off the Stanford very much, both in how it defines philosophy of religion, but also how it sets out its own main themes and problems. And again, we see that diversity and pluralism is included, but it's down the bottom of a range of themes and problems. I'm racing through these very quickly. We don't have to go through all these in detail. The Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy lists main themes, but religious diversity is far closer to the top. So it really reflects the priorities of the IEP and how it situates itself within the context, a debate around philosophy of religion. So questions about religious pluralism, religious relativism, religious exclusivism, are much more important in the IEP in terms of its debate or approach to philosophy of religion. There are, of course, all the standard um, arguments listed there, but it's significant, I think, that religious diversity is much more relevant and has better coverage in the IEP. Oh, that was really fast. Okay, this is good. So, in their article, Philosophy Democratized, a comparison between Wikipedia and two other web-based philosophy resources, Beate Alverbach actually looked at philosophy more generally and how themes are being covered within these three contexts. So they've done some analysis, and they found that they wanted to know whether the democratic approach of Wikipedia differed significantly from web-based, but more traditionally constructed encyclopedia of philosophy. So both the SEP, the Stanford, and the IEP are more canon-based encyclopedias, you might say. So they found that in terms of philosophers represented in each of the three online sources, the Stanford was more likely to include older philosophers from the canon pre-1900, or dead white guys, as these are more affectionately known by those of us who teach and work within the discipline of philosophy. And the IEP includes more recent philosophers, including spring chickens born in 1940, although it still includes plenty of dead white guys. Wikipedia, however, includes philosophers from across the 20th century, and the proportion of dead white guys born pre 1900 is about half that of Stanford. So Elverbeck read this to mean that Wikipedia does not, like other reference works, contain only philosophers who are already an accepted part of the philosophical canon. It does not represent philosophers only as historical figures who somehow have been granted a right to be included in the tradition. Many of the relatively younger philosophers that are currently active, like Martha Nussbaum, if I say relatively younger compared to other disciplines that within the context of philosophy. So in that way, suggests Belkovac, Wikipedia might be said to better reflect the current knowledge base and concerns of philosophers today dealing with contemporary issues and debates.
Hmm.
So I kind of set that context because Elverbeck also looks at comparing the diversity of disciplines. So where philosophy connects with other disciplines and how each of these major encyclopedias approach that. And you can see here of issue of interest to what we might be talking about today is the topic of spirituality, which does not appear in either the Stanford or the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So this is philosophers working on issues of spirituality, approaching some interdisciplinary kind of work, whereas it does appear in Wikipedia. Still a small percentage, but comparatively an improvement to some of the mainstream philosophical approaches perhaps. So I did my own. This is where I became a sociologist of some sort, I suppose, not interviewing but looking at how these terms appear, or at least I engaged in quant analysis of my own without any methodology whatsoever. But I looked up, so that Christ, I looked up these key terms that might appear in philosophy of religion. That should be a little star, not a plus symbol. So looking at the terms Christ and variations thereof, Christianity, Christian, Judaism or Jew, Buddhist, Buddhism, Buddha, Islam, Muslim, and Hindu, Hinduism, and yeah. And in terms of sheer volume or kind of information provided, the Stanford is most comprehensive and Wikipedia is least comprehensive. But the term spiritual appears in the Stanford only 2 times in the text. The other 4 references are in other 4 times it's mentioned is in the reference list. And predominantly Stanford deals with issues of Judeo, Chris, uh, Christian Judeo philosophical concerns. So, Christian traditions or Christian questions of philosophy of religion, I should say, are overrepresented compared to the other religions, and spirituality barely rates a mention. Whereas Wikipedia spends much less time on looking at issues of interest in philosophy of religion around Christian questions, and much has spent a lot more time on Buddhism or Buddhist approaches to spirituality or philosophy of religion, including spirituality. So I'd have to do a lot more work on this to make any kind of claim worth publishing. But I think it shows that if we want to look at what philosophy of religion is interested in the traditional, in philosophy and kind of in the canon of philosophy, its interests are still very much in these traditional Judeo-Christian questions around the nature of religion, the nature of God, the question of evil, good, the nature of suffering, all of those from a Judeo-Christian approach. Whereas more recent turns towards philosophy of religion include other diverse faiths and also questions of spirituality, which is of a lot more interest to people today. So let me go again through this next slide quite quickly. Hope everyone's having their second coffee and keeping up here. So spurred on by this admittedly circumstantial but highly curious development, I've then gone, okay, well, what is this distinction between spirituality and religion? Because that is very much what we've in our discussions I've had with my colleagues at Deakin. This is a division that keeps cropping up as something that's emerging as an interesting division. And the word spiritual, and how we use these terms itself, there's a kind of history to it here, because the term spiritual, as we might use it in the context of religion, really only emerged in the 14th century, where we also have a real rise of mysticism within Christian practices in Europe. And then the term spirit has a rich history around not only the idea of soul, but also other elements that we that we don't just link with spiritual as in abstract, but also more a primal motivation of human beings. So soul breath, the breath of God in Judaism is not just out there, but in us. Religion, on the other hand, has a much stronger connection to social and political organization and the structuring of one society. So there's a definition here: to bind fast, to place an obligation on, or to reflect a bond between human and gods. And this really ties religion to kind of the civic or practice that emerged in um, Roman cultures and the organization of society, and that arguably made a strong influence in the West as well, especially through Christendom and medieval period where church and state were more united than they are today. Again, I need to do a lot more work on this. Now I want to go really quickly through three characters that I'm interested in and that I want to say how spirituality emerges today and influences emerges as an influence in the public today. The first character is Paul Hill, a former Presbyterian minister who was arrested and trialed and eventually executed for killing a abortion provider, Dr. John Bayard Britton, and his bodyguard. At his trial, Hill attempted to present a defense claiming that his actions had been justifiable homicide since he was protecting the lives of the unborn children. He tried to prevent the murder of unborn children. The judge refused to allow this argument in court, and Hill had no other defense. So he was sentenced to death and rejected any effort to appeal the verdict. He effectively saw himself as a martyr, and he told reporters that he would be a martyr in the anti abortion movement, and he expected a reward in heaven because he had followed God's instructions in killing the abortion provider. His final words to his followers were, if you believe abortion is a lethal force, you should oppose the force and do what you have to do to stop it. May God help you to protect the unborn as you would want to be protected. On his death, a massive thunderclap rattled the sky just as Paul Hill was scheduled to die by lethal injection on September 3rd, 2003. His followers who were standing outside the facility believed this was a sign of God. When they crucified Jesus, the heavens darkened, said Neil Horsley, an activist who was present. Speak to this nation, O Lord, speak your wrath. So there they are. Jeffrey Kaplan, in kind of reviewing and analyzing these events, said that the anti-abortion movement was so successful in the violent anti-abortion movement emerged in part because of a strong mystical identification between the protesters and the unborn children that they were saving, and a mystical identification that they believed came from God. This explains much of their kind of their approach to and their justification for violent action. So that's my first example. The second example, I'm going to speak faster and faster. So I know I can be sure I have met a bit of time. In 1991, Danu, a female suicide bomber from the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, the LTTE, killed the Indian politician Rajiv Gandhi. And she's pictured here. I think she's the one wearing the orange flowers in her hair. This was taken moments before the politician's death. She had the explosives strapped to herself. She bent down to pay respect to by his feet and detonated the device, killing both the politician and a number of others within that circle around her. Following her death, as many other and those others of other Tamil tigers, Prabhakaran, the head of the LTTE political wing, declared that Danu had given the ultimate gift, her act, as all such sacrifices by the Black Tigers, a gift of themselves. Their death is not ordinary, but it signifies a profound spiritual aspiration for national freedom. They are martyrs who die in the arena of struggle with intense passion for the freedom of their people. Clearly, there are very strong political elements here, and scholars have argued as to the role religions play in this modern account of struggles for national identity. But, suggests one scholar, there is a dream of a homeland which is understood spiritually as the motherland of Tamil Ilam. And the word that they use is not suicide, but self sacrifice. And there's a word, specific word, that really heightens the spirituality of that act for one's people. And the final one I want to present, a final character or figure, is George Floyd. And go back to, we've talked about mysticism, spirituality, but go back to that original word that I raised about in relation to spirit, the word breath. And I think those words by George Floyd resonated very powerfully in 2020, the year in which the air was suddenly filled with a mysterious pathogen that turned face masks into legal requirements and political tools. This was also the year that gave us George Floyd. And perhaps it resonated so powerfully because it did emerge, this event emerged in the midst of a global pandemic. We were all worried about breathing. Breath was on our collective minds. And something that we had previously taken for granted, suddenly we kind of resonated that with this a lot more. And George Floyd showed the basic truth of how our world, collective world, is actually racially divided, because we've been able to breathe without restriction for a very long period of time, and most of us were only inconvenienced by the events of 2020 and having to wear face masks and such things. George Floyd and other non-white populations have for a long time not been able to breathe in the way that they cannot express their own freedom and their own sense of spirit. So if we look at breath as the most basic necessity of human pneuma or spirit, freedom from oppression, we are now speaking about our most spiritual obligations at both our most spiritual and our most religious. Breath is what binds us together, whether we like it or not. And this is something I think that emerged in 2020. The meaning of these words, I can't breathe, in this situation are still unfolding, but the respect and the homage that we pay to George Floyd is also a recognition of the profound spiritual aspiration, to borrow the words of Prabharakan in relation to the Tamil Tigers, for a desire of freedom from the oppression that non-white people experience at the hand of white people and our institutions. So this is an aspiration not tied to national identity, but as a protest against global colonial powers, which is a far more kind of universal aspiration, and therefore possibly more spiritual as well. Let me return quickly to the start, where I began with the critique of philosophy of religion in contemporary philosophy. It's concerned with puzzles of interest to philosophers, the nature of religion, of God, features of the cosmos that largely emerged from a Judeo-Christian context. More recent explorations in philosophy include diverse religious expressions and experiences, and more explicitly explores the spiritual dimension of religion, which are of interest now to emerging academic philosophers, but also the wider community. So I've looked at some of the different ways spirituality and religion have interacted with public life in violent ways, which are of interest to me as a philosopher, in part because we tend to notice violent expressions. We find them arresting because they interrupt our everyday lives and our peaceful daily existences. We are horrified, shocked, confronted, and we don't know how to explain these eruptions. But in a world where the remnants of religiosity are the concerns of aging philosophers and churchgoers, aging churchgoers in pews, arguably, spirituality and breath is something that has emerged in a public consciousness. And I think it should be of concern for philosophers today who are interested in engaging with lived religious and spiritual experiences. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Petra. That was wonderful. Thank you. I can just feel the discussion points and the questions mounting towards the end of our session. Thank you
I'm sorry,
so much,
I went
Petra.
2 minutes over. Sorry.
Naughty girl, naughty girl. Welcome to people who've just joined. We're thankful for your presence so early on a Saturday morning. We're up about halfway through our session now, and we're going to turn to Gillian Tan, and she's going to present us with a paper called Human-Nonhuman Relationships in the Making of Place. Thanks, Gillian.
Thanks, Lyn. I'm not sure that I'll be able to be as good with time as both Petra and Andrew, but I'll try. And again, I've changed the title, Religion in the Making of Human-Environment Relationships. So again, thank you, Lyn, for organizing this panel. I really look forward to the discussion at the end. You know, really to talk about various expressions of religion, but also around the different methodologies directed towards this concept. I really think that iterative and dynamic processes shape the objects of attention, and that this panel, in fact, offers a compelling opportunity to probe more deeply into the concept of religion itself. So by way of brief background, and this presentation is really going to be in two main parts. I'm sort of going to reflect about my main area of research, which is with Tibetan nomadic pastoralists. And it's an area that I've sort of been engaged in for the past 15 years. And sort of to then also think about anthropology and its sort of contribution in a disciplinary sense to this particular panel. But then also the second part of this presentation is really going to focus on a paper that I've been working on and sort of developing with Lyn for a collaborative piece looking at settler-colonial relations in Australia towards place and land. So I'm hoping to tie it all together in a way that makes sense, not only on its own, but also as a contribution to this panel. So just again, by way of brief background, I'm an anthropologist, and my work has focused on long-term ethnographic fieldwork with a particular community of Tibetan nomads, which in total sort of amounts to about 14 months over the past almost 15 years. In addition, my research methods refer to Tibetan language text, to Chinese language documents, and also to English, but also occasionally French sources, particularly in the areas of history, Buddhist philosophy, and on the religious beings, iconography and practices of the Tibetan plateau. I have published on the way of life of Tibetan nomads and their adaptations to pastures, and also to the external changes brought by Chinese government policies and international development programs. But increasingly in the past sort of 5 years or so, my research has focused more and more on human, non-human, and in this I include the environment relationships on the Tibetan plateau. So just a few words by way of anthropology and its sort of contributions, I suppose, to discussions in this panel, but also in terms of method. I suppose the sort of main sort of driving question in anthropology is the very broad one of what it means to be human. And in order to explore this, you know, by looking at a range of different communities and societies around the world, we also resort to key methods, and the main one being long-term participant observation. This is often referred to as ethnographic fieldwork in a particular setting, but it can also be on a particular theme and be multi-sited. This often results in written ethnography, and it very often, almost always, requires language competency in the sort of setting or location of one's research, and as well a kind of openness to the unknown and the unexpected. And that's the sort of openness that says perhaps the research questions that we go into in a particular setting might not be the questions that are most important for the people that we're speaking with. And a sort of very well known, and I suppose in this particular context, relevant example is, French philosopher, French anthropologist, and also trained as a philosopher, Philippe Descola, who went to do his ethnographic fieldwork amongst the Achua of the Amazon. And he was a sort of direct protege of Claude Lévi-Strauss. And his intent was to understand what, the Achua of the Amazon thought about and related to in terms of nature. And lo and behold, his surprise was that they had no concept of nature. And there was nothing in their sort of vocabulary or their attitudes to this sort of, the nature of the Amazon, of the Amazonian rainforest that sort of signaled this term. So that's just an example of the kind of openness to the unknown, to the surprising, that is very much, I think, at the heart of an anthropological sort of method. The other really important one is the comparative. And it's comparative rather than comparison, because if you don't have an object already sort of delineated, then clearly the comparisons are going to sort of be exposed, or the difficulties with comparison will be exposed. But a comparative method, sort of, I suppose, in the method of comparing, throws up quite different insights. There's, of course, a kind of basic comparative between the perspective of the ethnographer and with the setting or theme of study. But there's also additional anthropological comparatives that can be drawn up across different settings and themes. So, for example, one were to look at a comparative method between, sort of Tibet and Papua New Guinea, or again, maybe between Tibet and the broader Himalayas. That would be sort of something that is invoked by this method. It also includes temporal dimensions, and in this regard, I suppose the difference or the distinction between anthropology and history becomes less marked, and that could be, sort of even looking at the one particular community or setting across time. But whatever it is, I think a comparative method invokes insights that are generative and creative because, again, of its connection to this sort of openness to the unknown and the unexpected. I think what I guess I'll focus on now is the kind of broader question that frames this paper. And that broader question, again, taking to sort of heart this idea of comparison, is what is revealed by a comparison of Tibetan attitudes and Australian settler colonial attitudes towards the environment. And I use the word reveal here quite purposefully, since reveal or revelation is indexed in Tibetan as ter, this word ter. And it's an important ritual act of Tibetan tantric practitioners. And what that means is, and I'll just give a very brief outline, is a terton or tantric treasure revealer will very often go to a particular place in order to reveal previously hidden treasures that were placed there by either a tantric master or a previous incarnation of this practitioner. So at moments of emergency or stress, what will happen is where the canon or the sort of teaching of sort of Buddhist and also tantric sort of lineage is under threat, that treasure will be hidden to be revealed at a later date in the future. And a terton or treasure revealer enables that to occur. Very often these treasures are you can sort of delineate according to two: a mind treasure or an earth treasure. So mind treasures tend to be direct teachings that can be sort of invoked, but an earth treasure is usually an object, and that object is very often hidden in a place, which makes the environment then not just a kind of homogeneous kind of space, but something impregnated with meaning and with immense potential. And when you go to this particular place, what the practitioner does is usually he, but also often a she, opens that place in order to reveal previously hidden treasures. And this opening is the ritual of the terma. Right, so that's all sort of incorporated as one dimension of human environment relationships in Tibet. This, for example, the image that you're seeing on the screen, that is clearly a mountain, but it's also more than a mountain, because this is a Zhuddak, or a territorial deity, and within this sort of area has been found earth treasures, which are these specific objects that are related to the ritual of revelation. I think what, just very brief example of treasure revelation sort of highlights in terms of human environment relations in Tibet is the interdependence and the very, very sort of complexity of this kind of what I call, I suppose, a ritual complex involving the practitioner, the tantric practitioner, the earth treasure itself, and the environment, or this particular place that must be considered as a whole. So to sort of disentangle it is one thing by way of analysis, an analytical method, but it must always sort of, I think, be considered as a whole, as it would be in a kind of indigenous understanding of this. What it also reveals is a kind of understanding of categories of what is human, of what is non-human, or what is the environment, as distinctions of degree rather than that of kind. And this is a very important point for me, because it's something that I'm going to go into a little bit when I talk about the paper itself, and how categories as distinctions of degree rather than of kind is something that is perhaps not as present in we could say modern, but I think I'd at this forum be more comfortable to say Christian and sort of understandings of what a category or what a classification is. All right, so that's just by way of introduction. Can you believe it? And now I'll just go into what I hope will be a helpful contribution to this discussion. And the paper itself is a focus on Australian settler colonial attitudes towards the environment, which I think throws up something quite radically different from what I found in Tibet. And in this paper, what I'm going to do is focus on one strand of influence on this attitude. And that strand is a kind of genealogy of English attitudes to the natural world from 1500 to 1800, with a particular focus on English Romanticism through its literature. So the suggestion here is that this strand, I guess, or a development, a genealogy of thinking, continues to affect contemporary Australian attitudes to the natural world. And what I've been looking at with Lyn is one expression of that, which is in the writings of Tim Winton, contemporary Australian writer. For this particular part, I've referred very heavily to Keith Thomas's excellent history called Man and the Natural World, in changing attitudes between man and the environment in England from 1500 to 1800. And it's really a wonderful history where he puts together from various different textual sources a kind of narrative of what these changes in attitudes have been over the course of these 3 centuries. Again, it's important to note that it's a dominant narrative, but it's certainly not a comprehensive one, in that he as in Thomas, acknowledges very clearly that, what he might have presented as a dominant narrative, say in the 1500s, would also have had very sort of nuanced, different narratives going on at the same time. And the main one being that, say, in the 1500s, the dominant narrative or Christian narrative of nature as creation of God, with natural laws seen as moral norms, and man's relationship with the natural world, which will include not only the environment, but also animals and plants, is one of domination and mastery. Can also be seen in terms of Christian stewardship, for example, and can also be seen as, sort of through the teachings of St. Francis of Assisi, who, as we know, is kind of the patron saint of animals, because he used to preach to the birds. So, so it's important to keep that in mind, that what I'm going to present is a dominant narrative, but it's not comprehensive. And Thomas himself takes great pains to make that distinction. What is the dominant narrative, I think, in the 16th century is that of human exceptionalism. And this exceptionalism or uniqueness is based on three attributes: speech, reason, and free will, or moral will, moral agency. There's a kind of very clear sort of dominant theme in the suppose mainly Christian dominated doctrines of the time, that there a transcendent God, which is one that stood outside his creation, symbolized the separation between spirit and nature. And in that same way, man stood to animal, as did heaven to earth. So as there was a kind of mastery of heaven over earth, so too was there mastery of man over animal. And in that same way, a kind of parallel that you could draw around the soul to the body, and of culture to nature. And here, this is very important as one of the points where the comparison with Tibet is most clear, that there was a total qualitative difference between man and brute, right? So man, by virtue of having an immortal soul, was different in kind to that of animal, right? Rather than that of degree, which is something that I think comes about very clearly in the Tibetan case. There are lots of examples. I don't want to go on about it too much, but the examples that Thomas brings up are not only doctrinal ones, but also very much sort of social customs, so that a sort of analysis of text around literature, but also around, sort of treatises in that time mention things like maintaining boundaries between animal and human in order to sort of reaffirm human exceptionalism, right? So civilization and civility were in the realm of the human. So you wouldn't, the sayings, even common sayings, so something like, don't smack your lips like a horse, or don't gnaw the bones like a dog, or don't lick the dish like a cat. All of these things are about sort of maintaining in a very kind of common everyday way, this kind of boundary between man and animal. Now, what's the next step in this sort of changing attitudes is, or Thomas brings up, is the rise of the natural sciences in sort of changing these attitudes. Again, the rise of the natural sciences very much in terms of field naturalists, right? Botany, zoology, ornithology, which all advocated this kind of observation of the natural world, an observation that was neutral, an observation that was experimental, that was testable. All of these things came together in some way to shift this kind of idea of or the accepted idea of man's domination or man's mastery of the natural world, and certainly in terms of man's exceptionalism, to something a little bit more in line with a neutral, rational, let's take that as our starting point, basically, right? Rather than this Christian doctrinal position that man's immediately superior. Let's try to quantify that, I suppose, in some way, objectivize it. But in that quantification and objectification, especially in terms of Linnaeus's observation of the great apes, for example, and primates, came this sort of questioning and some kind of anxiety really about what it was that made man so very different from the primates, what made man so very different from the apes. So that was a kind of shift that Thomas brings out that was really kind of important in this changing development. The other shift was that this sort of learned scholarly approach to the natural world, something that was reasoned, based in objective views, increasingly became something different from the kind of popular experience of the natural world, you know, something that was experiential, that was about folklore or hearsay, then became somewhat demonized, then became somewhat sort of, you know, oh, well, that's the sort of like country bumpkin view of the natural world. This is us. We've established something that's quite sort of scholarly and learned. So basically, the summary in this sort of section is that the 17th and 18th centuries saw a fundamental departure from assumptions of the past. And instead of perceiving nature primarily in terms of analogies and resemblances to men, that naturalists had begun to study nature in its own right. And what happened here was eventually a kind of fundamental distinction between nature and society. And this is really where a kind of nature-culture dichotomy, starting around the time, I don't know, want to always pin him down, but Descartes, around the time of Descartes, would eventually harden into something that then in the sort of 1800s would be what the English Romantics would speak against, right? This is something that they would eventually try to overcome, because in this kind of time, in this 3 centuries, where we end up with at 1800s and then slightly after, was a very different attitude to the natural world. Because by the later 18th century into the early 1800s, emerged a very romantic point de vue spectaculaire. And what that was a delight in the world's diversity, right? A reluctance to judge that natural diversity by human standards. And what Thomas calls it is, in fact, a revolution in perception about man's place in the world. This also correlates with the rise of the middle classes through the Industrial Revolution, right? The increasing kind of distancing of these middle classes from the fields and the animals of the agrarian past, right? Into something urban, aspirational, sensitive, and I add here Protestant, because that's also something that's quite clear in the change. When Henry VIII declared himself the King of England and disassociated himself from the Catholic Church, something else also happened by way of man's relationship with the natural world. That's too much to go into right now. But what I will now go into just for the last part, and I don't know what I'm doing with time, probably very badly, is this kind of idea that once you've had a kind of separation of nature from human society, once that cleavage becomes quite hardened, then there's a rupture, right? And the English Romantics were very much trying to recapture that in an important way. Here, I just take a quote from Steigerwald, that says the human being was considered physically to be a part of the greater environment and as only understood in relation to it, and yet as an investigating subject to be separated from nature as the object of his or her inquiry. To conceive the relationship between human being and nature, between the phenomena of nature and its conception required an act of imagination, a creative leap across an uncharted domain. And I added the italics there. And the reason why I bring this quote up is because I think this very much forms the foundation for how the English Romantics were dealing with the kind of rupture that was caused, begun by the Industrial Revolution, certainly, and compounded by the rise of the middle classes and its associated sensibilities. Because then by this time, which is, you know, sort of early 1800s up until maybe 1830, 40, what we can see is a kind of increasing personification of nature. So nature is now personified as pure, untouched, and wild. And there's an increasing importance given to the spiritual in terms of the sublime, in terms of the glorious and the childlike. Importantly, this is all also very much found or discovered in a kind of solitude. And this solitary kind of sort of method in processes of re-enchantment, which I call it, you can see very clearly in the works of the English Romantic poets, especially, you know, words like hermit, alone, soul, solitude, seclusion, all of these things come up over and over again in the poetry of people like Wordsworth and Blake and Keats. And the last point I'm just going to make here is that it's visionary, it's imaginative, dynamic, and emotive. All of these are characterizations of the sentiments that are now inspired by the natural world, right? So 300 years later, what we see is this kind of new or different attitude to the natural world. I don't have time here to read this poem, I don't think, but I just put it up because I think Wordsworth, of all the Romantic poets, most captures this particular kind of set of sentiments. You know, on his return to Tintern Abbey, what does he discover? You know, the deep seclusion, the connection of the land with the quiet of the sky. The day has come when I again repose here under this dark sycamore and view these plots of cottage ground, these orchard tufts which at the season with the unripe fruits are clad in one green hue and lose themselves mid groves and copses. And what we see here very much so is that there is a kind of spirituality in nature, and that this spirituality is what is going to recover or re-enchant man and bridge that rupture caused by the modernization of the Industrial Revolution. So I'll just end really, you know, going towards the end to say something very briefly about Tim Winton. I don't want to say too much in Lyn's presence because it will be like, you know, I don't know, talking about Jesus with Jesus around or something like that. But really, you know, in Winton's work, which I've looked at here, just the memoirs, Island Home and Land's Edge, I see very much in this particular way, a continuation of the English Romantic sort of intention or aim. And this is very much couched in his presentation of Australia as landscape, you know, in the vast expanse, in the larger than self, in the uncontrollable, in the speck, you know, in this vastness, but also because of the speck in the vastness, the associated terror of the unknown. This, I think, is very much a sort of indication of a nostalgia. It's a nostalgia caused by rupture, not only of subject and object, but also in time and distance that's amplified in the modern condition. And it's very important here, at least for Winton, that this nostalgia is not necessarily rosy, right? I mean, very often in the case of someone like Wordsworth, it was, you know, sort of rosy and beautiful, you know, there's sort of dew on the April blossom. Whereas for Tim Winton, you know, there's often a cussedness, a stench, a death that's associated with this. But I think that in itself, you know, contributes to this idea of the rupture and the fractured mind. Again, from Island Home, I'm just going to read a quote. where Tim Winton talks about his own sort of inspirations. And it was the real recluses who stirred my imagination, he writes. The scowling misfits in barely accessible hollows, those who retreated to the shadows until you gave up and moved on. Enchanted by Blake and Wordsworth and steeped in the eremitic characters of religious history, like Simeon Stylites or Julian of Norwich, I found their stubborn isolation irresistible. So I think, you know, that sort of, I think in some ways sort of encapsulates a lot of what I see as a kind of lingering influence of this genealogy. By way of a conclusion, I think that what comparing expressions of religion allows us to sort of probe is, you know, what I've tried to do here is those relationships that people have with the environment around them. So in some ways, one could frame mountain deities in Tibet according to English Romantic notions of pure spiritual nature. And you see this quite a lot, in fact. I wonder if it's not one of the things that are at play when, for example, teenagers in Australia say, I believe in reincarnation, right? There's a kind of positive, not positivist, but a kind of positive association of Buddhism as a sort of kind of, you know, pure spiritual, you know, thing. And that mountains there are another expression of that, especially because the mountains are very beautiful and aesthetic. But I think doing this, framing mountain deities in Tibet in terms of English Romantic notions of what is pure and spiritual actually avoids or sidesteps a couple of crucial points. First, and most important for me as an anthropologist, is that it sidesteps taking seriously Tibetan conceptions of interdependence and categories of being as different by degree, not by kind. But second, I think the other thing that sidesteps is, in fact, doesn't pay adequate attention to the history of one's own sort of genealogical sort of concepts, right? So it doesn't pay due attention to the complex religious and spiritual influences, say, on romantic attitudes to the natural world. And I think really, and that's probably where I'll end it, I think that's what the comparative method allows us to do more sharply. Thanks.
Thank you, Gillian.
That was wonderful, Gillian. And both an inspiration and a provocation. I'm going to think about that notion of nostalgia that you introduced to us. And how's everyone travelling? We've had 3 papers and mine is the last, and then we'll have probably a good 20 minutes to discuss so many issues. But I should have probably picked on Tim Winton, shouldn't I? And I've written something here to compare. But in fact, I've chosen to look at William Blake's poem, Auguries of Innocence. Now, I'm going to share the screen with you, if I can find it. Hang on, we'll go off that. Won't take a sec. Let me see. Now I'm going to have the same question as you did, I think. Can people see that all right?
Maybe bottom right for the Mac version of PowerPoint.
Yes. There we are. Thank you. That's right. It was too, Gillian. So everyone can see that, can't they? That's the first slide, but I'm going to start by saying you may not think that you know Blake's poetry, or you may. Blake was an early romantic, and I guess a lot of the things that Gillian's been talking to us about will be tested through listening to Blake and where he stands in all of this. I think probably as a literary studies person, my methodology is a lot more about the individual formation of the different poets and their differences than it is those kind of categorical uses. But I can see that both are really important. But if you don't know Blake at all, you'll know his poem Auguries of Innocence, where he begins by saying, to see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. A robin redbreast in a cage puts all heaven in a rage. A dove house filled with doves and pigeons shudders hell through all its regions. That's just the very opening of the poem. So today we've heard from sociologists, philosophers and anthropologists around the question of religious study. In literary studies, the written text, as you probably all know, is fundamental, forming the object of study, traditionally in what the discipline calls close textual analysis or close reading. But in literary studies, historical and ideological contexts are highly important too, with methodologies akin to Bible studies in some ways. Close textual analysis can mean a number of things. It can mean thematics, aesthetics, writing technique. When religious studies and literary studies conjoin, this is my question for this paper today, what is made possible? How much can we speculate about this phenomenon, religion / spirituality / theology, both at a local level, the particular text being read, and that's where I would come in here, the particularity, the historical moment of the text's origin. So with Blake, it is the end of the 1700s into the 1800s, the period that Gillian was talking about at one point. The particular text being read, the historical moment, the reader's response or interpretation, and the author's so-called position. And at a wider level, asking about the nature of belief, doubt, and disbelief. So as I said to you, my text today is William Blake's iconic, very much read 1803 poem, Auguries of Innocence. So I'm not going to do a close analysis of the text. We don't have time to do that because it's quite long actually, except where it contributes to both local and broader questions about religion. It's necessary to say from the outset, although this will become obvious as we read, that Blake was unusual in numerous ways. So here's the exceptionality and the sort of moving against the kind of categories, if you like, of romanticism. One 19th century Blake enthusiast, and I underline the word enthusiast, Alexander Gilchrist, in his star-struck biography, I think you call it, Life of William Blake, 1863, warned his readers that Blake, quote, neither wrote nor drew for the many, hardly for working day men, sick, at all, rather for children and angels. Himself a divine child, whose playthings were sun, moon and stars, the heavens and the earth. So there's a biographical note to hit there. As a child, Blake said he saw, and he's often quoted as saying this, a tree filled with angels, bright angelic wings bespangling every bough like stars. So we're in the realm of an unusual romantic, although he's got many sort of general romantic attributes that we'll come at in a second. As a romantic, this includes consideration of his particular brand of propheticism. So many people would would quite easily say poet and prophet, William Blake. But he also mixed a lot with radical political thinkers, artists, artisans, revolutionaries, and wrote a number of long poems around themes of political revolution. So he's not a simple or single-stranded poet, but deeply entrenched in the political questions of his time. He was born in 1757, and so that Blake's 20s and 30s were, of course, the decades of the French and American revolutions. He was 8 years old in 1765 when the British-American War began. And in his work, America, in 1793, he wrote of revolution that it would, quote, scatter religion abroad to the four winds as a torn book, and none shall gather the leaves. There's that prophetic voice. Blake's vision of social justice colours all his works. He wrote against corruption and repression as rabid in church and state. And this is interesting, is that when we look at the kind of doctrinal and centralist doctrines of the church during this period, Blake was not there. So yes, we can set up those central premises, and they were pervasive in lots of ways. And then you had this incredible poet, not all that well known in his own time, but since then become a god in the literary world, who was not of the same ilk. He called out the repression and corruption and the effects of moralizers of his day. I love the fact that he's such a prophet and such a moralizer, but he's blowing his horn against the other moralizers of the time. So there's a kind of, I don't know, look at your own darkness, I suppose. In his monumental Marriage of Heaven and Hell, so this is to give you an example of where he stands on the spiritual / political of his period, and here's where the slide becomes relevant. He wrote this in Marriage of Heaven and Hell. Prisons are built with stones of law, brothels with bricks of religion. The pride of the peacock is the glory of God. The lust of the goat is the bounty of God. The wrath of the lion is the wisdom of God. The nakedness of woman is the work of God. So I've just said here, parse that as you will. It's not an easy theology to boil down, but we can begin to see and hear the poet's principles, I think, in this. He valued the unrepressed energy of the human. He valued individual imagination, which sees law and church and platitudinous moralizing as repressors of what he calls the human energies, sexual, political, human, non-human, divine, that course through human life. So I think he does throw up a bit of a challenge, Gillian, to that question of the separation of human and non-human in really interesting ways. Certainly not nostalgic ways, but we'll come to that in a second. As we'll see in a moment in his poem Auguries of Innocence, Blake's visions often outed themselves in short, pithy dictums. A little bit prophetic there. Men forget that all deities reside in the human breast, he wrote. Or, judge then of thy own self, thy eternal lineaments, explore what is eternal and what changeable and what annihilable. And also, I am not a God afar off, I am a brother and friend. So that was very much his Protestant notion of God within the human breast and within the imagination. And finally, in Jerusalem, his poem of 1804, he says, within your bosoms I reside, this is God speaking, and you reside in me. Blake was given to and is remembered through his aphorisms, but also as a writer of very long, intricate mythologies, mixtures of the poetic, the prophetic, historical, and mythological, in which many critics have seen ambitious schemes for righting the wrongs of religion as institution. So turning now to the second slide, Auguries of Innocence, we read these words. I read them out a few minutes ago, so I won't, because of time, read them again. But just look at the end section there. We've read up to the pigeons and the hell's regions. A dog starved at his master's gate predicts the ruin of the state. A horse misused upon the road calls to heaven for human blood. This is no secluded hermetic figure. This is someone speaking in the crowded denizens of to and with and about the denizens of London at the time, and the cruel social practices that he's calling out here. As you can hear from those lines, Blake gets a bit prophetic. It gets a bit of a prophetic run-on here. I would suggest that the poem exhibits the following aspects shared by much, though certainly not all, religious thought and belief. And that's far too big a claim. I'll step back off that. But he does draw together, yes, particularly Christian aspects of religion, but much more than that, a much broader sense of what religious thought and belief is about. Belief in a spiritual realm, belief in a fundamental tension between good and evil, and certainly a judgment that's due, a hunger for social human justice, a hunger for justice for the non-human and for creation, seeing divinity in the natural world, that they are absolutely not separate, and belief in the existence of sin, most often linked to human violence and cruelty. So he's a Protestant in more ways than one, and a rebel. What I would call dogmatism and the tendency to preach, even though Blake detested the moralisers and the dogmatists of his day, those who put blinkers on human imagination. This poem, with its mind-blowing imaginative conjunctions, is also, as I've said before, preaching and wagging its finger. It's declaring its truth. That's what I like about Blake. One of the things I like about Blake. But at the same time, and perhaps contradictorily, the poem is offering a way beyond the binaries, I would argue, of sin and innocence and simplistic moralising. It cries out for originary innocence and for the imagination to be recognised as the crowning glory of his theology. And I think that's one of the claims of literary studies, but not only literary studies, other disciplines too, but the centrality of imagination is not something out separate from spirituality. We'll go that way and that way. All right. No, we'll go that way. All right, so this is a little piece from Auguries, a little bit further down the poem. And I want to jump off from this in a different direction. He who mocks the infant's faith shall be mocked in age and death. He who shall teach the child to doubt, the rotting grave shall ne'er get out. He who respects the infant's faith triumphs over hell and death. The child's toys and the old man's reasons are the fruits of the two seasons. So I found that really intriguing rereading that. Many of you will hear echoes here of Blake's famous collection of poems, Songs of Innocence and Experience. These are the ones that are always taught in literary studies curriculum because they're short and they can be grasped quite quickly by students. His theology is constant, though, I think, throughout his longer and shorter works. Its main planks are the innocence and the energy of the human being, seen most clearly in childhood, the infant's faith. The poem here values this capacity equally with reason, those last two lines there. At first blush, Blake's stress on the imagination seems to be at odds with his older contemporary, Immanuel Kant, who is remembered for his belief in rationality as the supreme principle of morality. And yet, the constitution of reason plumbed by Kant, and here's where Petra might correct me, my simplistic non-philosophical reading of Kant, the constitution of reason plumbed by Kant opens up into an understanding not far, I would suggest, from Blake's understanding. And looks like I haven't got a slide of that. Oh, well, this is a we'll go back to that, and I'll just read this quickly. Nearly finished, so we can have some discussion. This is the way in which I've come at Kant, and I've used, I hope it's okay, Petra, I think it was one of the ones that got a bit of a tick there, the Stanford entry on Kant. So I'm going to read that, and then I'm going to just look at the last passage of Blake to think about reason and morality connected to his notion of imagination. So it says of Kant in the Stanford, and we can talk about this later, a rational will must be regarded as autonomous or free in the sense of being the author of the law that binds it. The fundamental principle of morality, the categorical imperative, which we've all heard, is none other than the law of an autonomous will. Thus, at the heart of Kant's moral philosophy is a conception of reason, whose reach in practical affairs goes well beyond that of human slave to the passions. Moreover, it is the presence of this self-governing reason in each person that Kant thought offered decisive grounds for viewing each person as possessed of equal worth and deserving of equal respect. Now, that's a bit of a pause on Kant, and we can talk about it if we want to or correct it. But I don't have the scholarship to know whether Blake had direct knowledge of Kant's work, and maybe somebody here will be able to enlighten me. I did do a little bit of study to try and find out, but I doubt that he did, because given Blake's sequestered and reasonably autodidactic learning, I don't think he would have known Kant's work in any intimate way. Yet you can begin to see the common threads, I would argue, between Kant's autonomous will and Blake's championing of the freedom to think and express and to live justly. You will, I think, enjoy this call from Blake's work, Milton. This is the last thing I'm going to read, because it is both the cry of a poor, rebellious 18th century artist, and he had no recognition in his time and lived very meagerly in London or just outside of London. This comes from his work, Milton, which was 1804 to 1810, because it's calls for a justice against what he calls the hirelings in the camp, the court, and the university. And I'll read you that. He says, "Rouse up, O young men, sick of the new age. Set your foreheads against the ignorant hirelings. For we have hirelings in the camp, the court, and the university, who would, if they could, forever depress mental and prolong corporeal war. Painters on you I call, sculptors, architects, suffer not the fashionable fools to depress your powers by the prices they pretend to give for contemptible works, or the expensive advertising boasts that they make of such works. Believe Christ and his apostles that there is a class of men whose delight is in destroying. We do not want either Greek or Roman models, if we are but just and true to our own imaginations, those worlds of eternity in which we shall live forever in Jesus our Lord." So just to finish, I think you can hear in this passage the dogmatist and the freethinker. Human rights grounded in being just and true to your own imaginations, but also in the foundation, and in this particular case, it's the foundation of Jesus our Lord. And again, we see the prophet of energy, creativity, imagination, and not the mindset of hirelings. Returning to our first question about the study of religion, I want to ask, what role does and might the imagination play in exploring religion, beliefs, social justice, institutions, and individual subjects? What could we do better in dialogues between the creative arts, literary studies, sociology, anthropology, philosophy, when we are considering how religious studies works? This, I think, leads to other questions around methodologies and objects of study. At broader levels, the study of institutions and global trends, knowledge of diverse religious traditions, understanding of links between religion, power, politics, and education systems, and/or religion as values, as lived beliefs, practices, lived theologies at local levels. Tend to get different pictures when you do those too, don't you? These are different approaches, and both, I think, are valuable, but they can speak more productively to each other in religious studies, I think. So, thank you very much, everyone, for listening. And now we'll find out what the truth is.
Have you got it, Lyn?
Yes, I've got the truth and I'm about to tell you.
All right, hang on to it.
So I think we've got lots of questions, haven't we? We've got lots of room to move here. I think questions to the individual speakers, if people would like to ask those, and the panel's part of the questioning here as well. But also then we might come, if we can, draw back towards that question about where religious studies and methodologies stands at the moment. So who'd like to start us off with a question? It's hard to know where to begin, isn't it? can I just say, while people are thinking about their question, Gillian, I think that, I don't know, as you were speaking, I was thinking, I look at the individual poet, I look at the highly individualised activity of literary studies as interpreting this poet in this poem at this moment. Of course, the historical and the broader categories count, but I do that sort of work. And I was thinking, no, Blake's not like what Gillian's saying about romanticism. Yes, he is. So I was going like that. I don't know, does that put any dints in that kind of generalisation about romanticism?
Thanks, Lyn. No, I mean, I don't think so. I think I started out, with qualifying Thomas's historical work as saying he's providing a dominant narrative. But as we know, I think we can always sort of see complexities within the discussions and thoughts of that particular time, for example. So even when he talks about the dominant narrative of Christian mastery over nature of the 1500s, you get Saint Francis of Assisi. Like, you always have the person's the sort of sets of thoughts that are not subsumed, that are not always part of that dominant narrative. But that doesn't actually detract from the idea that there is a dominant narrative, that there is something that one can point to. And I wonder actually if it doesn't say something about surveys. It just occurred to me that one could point to something that is popular, I suppose, at the time. Even think about what is current now and what is dominant or popular. You'll always find in a deeper study or analysis of a particular situation, things that aren't going to fit. And I think that's part of the sort of richness of doing this sort of research and study, right? It's to not to have just the one thing. So in fact, I don't think it at all sort of detracts from the example of Blake, sorry, to be more specific, I don't think detracts from certain sorts of comments that one can make about romanticism of a particular variety. And I took actually very painful care to distinguish between English romanticism and, for example, German romanticism, because I see there that there's a lot more difficulty in sort of making a generalization. But I think with English romantics, we'll just poets, for example, again, more specific, there you can name 6 maybe in that particular sort of genre. And of course, they're going to differ from each other in different ways. But there's something that gives them that sort of cohesion. And I suppose I would add, not to dominate too much, but I would add that that's where the comparison is most helpful. Because, of course, you can point out all these differences, for English romanticism when you compare it, say, with German romanticism, or when you, sort of look at other strands, things or similarities become more sharp or more evident.
I don't want to dominate either, and we'll get off this and onto other papers too. I think that nostalgia and the kind of ways in which that characterization of romanticism working was very partial. I'd say that nostalgia would be the outer rims of Wordsworth. It's not Byron, it's not Shelley, it's not Blake. I would want to kind of say that who sets up the dominant paradigm? And again, as you say, goes back to Andrew's, but could you get some statistics here on what the central doctrines were at the time? You and I are going to nut that out in our writing of our paper, right? Some of these issues.
Of course.
Yes.
And I think really nostalgia really only makes sense in terms of rupture, right? In terms of a framing on rupture. That's all I would say at this stage.
All right, I'm going to move away from my interest in the romantics and ask other questions, please.
Well, I just noticed that Petra had a comment in the chat around Nietzsche and Kant, and I just wonder if that's something you had seen, Lyn, and you might want to pick up.
Let's see here, Petra.
Sorry, I've also posted a comment to Gillian. I think there are some philosophers are all about generalizations in many ways, seeing what we can make fit across great spans of time and things, as
Yes.
well as trying to tease apart distinctions. But I think maybe there are some, I don't want to say generalizations, but themes that you can identify as, well, these things happen in history. They are different. The German Reformation is different from the English Reformation, obviously, but they do influence. There is an influence that's happening there, and an intellectual influence. And in terms of, I just thought of what Nietzsche had said about Immanuel Kant, who he didn't think much of Immanuel Kant, and he talked about Immanuel Kant being the perfect representative of the German parson who had become a philosopher. You know, parsons were, I don't know, post-Enlightenment, maybe no, you know, the religious narrative of Protestantism was no longer convincing, but it turned into philosophy instead, and that's what Nietzsche's attacking very much. So that was just something I thought of, but that was not to correct anything that you correct. Oh my God, it's all open to interpretation, really. But that was not to say anything about Kant in relation to how you use Kant. It was just, yeah. Yeah. Anyway, someone else has their hand up.
Sharon has got a hand up. Thanks, Sharon.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the presentations. I missed the first one. I was very sad about that. I'm sorry, but all the others amazing. Petra, I just had a question for you. I was really interested in your distinction between spirituality and religion. I've found when interviewing, I'm a sociologist, so I found when interviewing strongly religious women belonging to fundamentalist faiths and cults that they do not call themselves religious, and they actually hate that term. So they're drawing a lot upon this term of spirituality, although they are definitively what I would define as a sociologist as being like they could not be more religious. So I'm really interested in this, but I was interested in your application of breath to spirit, to spirituality with George Floyd. And it was reminiscent to me of the connection in Hegel in the phenomenology of spirit, in which like it has this such a religious, like to me, that book is a religious book. But it's not, it was never phrased or framed as a religious book, it was framed as a philosophy. So I just wondered, what was your inspiration for your analysis of George Floyd and sort of relating the spirit, the breath to spirit, to spirituality?
George Floyd was completely done on the fly. I'd need to do a lot more work to defend that. And I was really interested in how, I mean, the breath and spirit, yes, there's a Hegelian context to that. And there's also a whole entry in Stanford on transcendentalism that relates to spirituality, which is not linked to philosophy of religion explicitly. So I thought later I could do something on that at some point. But to link back to fundamentalists, and they're not religious, they're spiritual. When you look at the claims that Paul Hill makes and other violent anti-abortion protesters, there's a mystical union between fundamentalist and God, or fundamentalist and the word of God, and even the doctrines that we would say are religious. No, they're not religious, they're spiritual, because they haven't got that connection to an institution, like what they would say is Protestant religion, say liberals, Anglicans, Catholics uniting, what in Australia, whatever the case may be. So they will say we're not religious in that context, but we would say no, they're religious in how they organize, how they behave, what they take as their forms of authority, perhaps. So I can see how they don't identify as religious and spiritual, but I guess I wanted to draw out the political implications of this spirituality. I don't yet know how to do it with George Floyd. It's way too new. It's still all reverberating, but I just thought, look, it's so interesting that when we talk about how if spirituality is somehow, we want to say spirituality is somehow separate from these organized institutions, it's beyond, above, permeates through in many ways that we can't categorize, this is sure that's exactly what breath is, right? And it's also so primal to how and what we are, and that's something I think that comes through Hegel as well, that this spirit, which he interpreted more or less, as in terms of Christian theology, as the Holy Spirit, but that is something that that we can't control, that comes through us, but also that which we can't do without. And so there's those connections that I want to make. But the tension here is between that which is institutionalized in various ways and that which escapes institutionalization, I think. And certainly an event like 2020 escapes our attempt to harness or institutionalize or control. And I think that's that kind of the significance of invoking that towards the end. But it's so, I really haven't thought this through. I've done some writing on Paul Hill and Danu in my book that came out in my thesis, but this is George Floyd. I haven't been able to really get my head around. And I don't know that anyone can anytime.
Petra, I'm going to claim you as a poet as well as a philosopher, because I think you're riffing on the metaphor of breath and breathing, the pneuma, and so on. You're starting to write a poem there about the breath and spirituality. I think that's good. Can I do that? Claim you as a poet?
I think it's all about interdisciplinary approaches here, Lyn, so I'm happy to go with that.
That's right, yeah, exactly. Other questions? Thanks, Sharon. That's interesting. Helen, go ahead.
This is something, thank you. And I just want to compliment and hooray all of the presenters today. My comment, and I guess I'm just throwing it back to anybody, is as the four presenters used language that reminded me of Pope Francis and what Pope Francis is doing, I kept jotting down things. And the comment that I really want to make is that all of the words that were used today, and I'm just looking at a couple of things, the connection between religion, theology, spirituality, the primal relationship with nature. Pope Francis always talks about the Amazon as the lungs of the earth, how the earth breathes. And his encyclical here, which is Beloved Amazon, really is something that any of you might enjoy reading, because it does bring the political, the spiritual, the theological together in this prophetic way. He's a radical thinker. He is advancing a new narrative within the Catholic tradition. And if you're looking at lived religion and pulling together all of the ideas that were raised today, starting from the discussion that we had before the presentations about decolonization, this book is full of ideas about decolonizing religion. So I'm just, anyone who would like to comment, please do. And I apologize that it's not a question.
No, it's interesting though.
Thanks for pointing out the encyclical, Helen. I'll just note that Francis's namesake is St. Francis of Assisi.
Sure.
So in some ways, for me, that's not new. It's a rejuvenation of something
exactly.
that has occurred many centuries in the past. So, but thanks for bringing that up.
I think a lot of us are sitting with all ears and hearts open, to the changes that are going on through Francis in the Catholic Church.
As a philosopher, Helen, I'm sitting here going, trust the Catholic to just bring it all together, right?
Well, there's so many countercurrents against Pope Francis. Quite a well-known Australian journalist once said after Pope Francis was elected, this journalist said, well, I hope he has a good food taster, because of the concern with those who would oppose Francis and the religious imagination that he's bringing. And I guess that's what I started thinking about, lived religion, and how Catholics are rediscovering, Roman Catholics, I should say, so much of our connection to the earth and to everybody in it and to every living thing in it. So yeah, there you go. So some Catholics are trying to bring it all together, others are not.
And that connection to the Amazon forest is the lungs of the earth is really powerful and really brings an ecological element, yeah, that could be included in all of these.
Can I ask Andrew a quick question?
Yes, I was going to ask Andrew a question too.
Oh,
yeah.
really? Well, what is this latent
you
class
go to
analysis, Andrew, that you were saying was this new fancy pants? Could you, like, to someone who's non-expert at all, just sort of, 1 minute dummy explain it?
We wanted to map the worldviews of the teenagers in our Australian Generation Z study, and so we asked this entire range of questions about all these existential, religious, spiritual, and non-religious matters, like, to the extent to which you align with sort of humanist precepts and whatever. And latent class analysis sort of sifts through all of that, and then a bit like when you divide up a class of school children, puts people who are most like other people, but it does so in a kind of like, not an absolute way, but you're most like these people, but you're not strictly entirely like them. And so that when you create this map that kind of maps these groups, but it's a bit equivocal of that. So we came up with these different spirituality types.
Yeah. And
yeah.
Would I be correct in assuming that it also gains a kind of meaning in relation to other groups? So if you're more like this, the implication is that you're less like this.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so if it's not absolute, then it's not a statement of you are this, but you're more like this. So then it already calls into question the comparison, I suppose, or the comparator.
It does, but it kind of like in each kind of group, there's like fuzziness around the edges. So in the past, we just go like, you're religious because you do this and that kind of practice. But if you ask it in a really inclusive and expansive way, it's like we come up with this group that's kind of like these teens who identify themselves as spiritual but not religious. But there's on the peripheries of that group that they were more like the spiritual, not religious, but they could have sat comfortably with a couple of other types. And so it's like, yeah, that's how it goes. And so when you then go and interview those teens, which is what we did to kind of make sure that this was a kind of realistic presentation, it's like they were like that, but they also had these tendencies. And so then when you write up this and present it, you sit with that equivocation, because that's the kind of the fundamental approach, is equivocal rather than absolute. And I just think it's a nice way of doing that sort of statistical thing. From the outset, you go, this is just a shakedown of today, and this is how these people look like. So, I mean, I've got a diagram somewhere, which it's all blurred around the edges that shows that. Sorry, Lyn.
No, I was just trying to understand what you're talking about, because I think it's really interesting that it seems to me what that's doing is saying, okay, we're going to reach some conclusions and some general pictures, but we can't really generalize in any sort of forthright or final way, because the blurring is part of the picture. So it's a question of that sort of generalization again, isn't it? That our different disciplines have different attitudes towards. It's anathema in literary studies in a lot of ways, not fully, of course, but you're also saying that it's under erasure or under question in your discipline too.
Yeah. We use languages like, chances are you're more like that than like that. The chances are.
I love it.
That's the thing. I noticed Helen's got a question interesting to research.
Oh, sorry, Helen.
No, we are. I mean, we've just done this big project, and I can tell you all about Catholic teens in Australia. There's very little recognition of Pope Francis amongst teenagers in Australia. How do I know? Because we went to all these schools around Australia and showed them photographs of people like the Dalai Lama and Pope Francis, and they're like, very little recognition. And the absolute majority of Catholic teens that kind of, there's a large proportion of teens in Australia identify as Catholic, and a very low proportion of them are kind of fully engaged with the church in a way that the Catholic Church might like. So,
Andrew, you need to broaden your sample, because so many of the teens that I work with and Catholic teachers, Catholic school teachers who are working in youth ministry, what they tell us and what I remember from my own classroom experience would suggest something different.
we had a huge sample. And far beyond the Catholic. I'm not talking about Catholic teenagers, I'm talking about teenagers writ large. And Catholic teenagers know who the Pope is, but beyond that, like the religious literacy of Australian teens is probably
I'm with you.
An all-time low. You know, you can show them quite literally a picture of the Dalai Lama and they're like, oh, yeah, guy, he looks familiar. You know.
Can I just add, I think just literacy, cultural literacy of Australian teens might be at an all-time low. Apparently they haven't heard of Bob Dylan.
All sorts of bad things. Can I just say that that's where a lot of my work has been in popular culture and popular cultural references to what I call the sacred, rather than to religion or to particular denominations. And I reckon they've got an incredible amount of literacy in the teenage world in terms of, you know, the deeply felt and understood and the lived and loved music, which brings in sacred and ethical aspects. It's certainly there then. Would you think so, Andrew?
Totally. Yeah. Just don't look at conventional objects and structures for where teens are going to make meaning, but there's this pursuit of the sacred and interest in finding meaning. Absolutely, yeah.
Well, I think we better finish because we're over time, aren't we, folks? But thank you, everyone, for your generosity and your interest. And no doubt we'll keep talking, hopefully.
Thanks for convening it, Lyn, and thanks, Helen, and all the other people who came. I think we had about 5 or something people, which
we had 9 at one point. Yeah, we had 5 others join.
Including the president of the association.
And thanks, Petra and Lyn and Gillian. It's so interesting to hear that.
And see you on Monday. Are we having another sort of catch up on Monday?
Lunchtime or something.
Is that right?
Who is having a catch up?
The network?
The RSC. The RSC, yes. Yeah, that's exactly. Okay, thanks, Helen, for your attendance too. See you all. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Yeah, thank you.